welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
So, you're curious about the word amen. Yeah. Where it actually comes from.
And whether it has these like deeper roots than we usually think.
Exactly. We've been digging into this really interesting critique. It was published in the Ghana Journal of Linguistics.
Right, and it's all about this book, The Origin of the Word Amen, Ancient Knowledge the Bible Has Never Told.
Quite a title. So, our mission today really is to unpack what the book claims, especially these links it tries to make between amen and ancient Kami, that's ancient Egypt, of course, and even the modern Akan language in Ghana.
We want to give you the main points, the sort of core insights from the critique's perspective.
Yeah, without getting totally bogged down in, super academic jargon. Okay, let's dive in.
So the book kicks off with this, well, pretty intriguing idea.
Which is?
That the ancient Kamdi word im, what we generally understand as amen, has actually survived. Like, it's still present in the modern Akan language.
Okay, that sounds potentially huge.
It does, but the critique we've been reading, it raises some, let's say, serious questions pretty quickly.
About how the book tries to make that connection.
Exactly. The critique basically says, look, this might sound simple, but the way the book goes about it, well, it runs into trouble.
Trouble how? Lack of evidence.
More like a lack of solid methodology. The critique points to a lack of deep knowledge in historical linguistics.
Okay. That's the study of how languages change over time.
Right. And also a limited understanding of hieroglyphs, the MDW NTR.
Words of the gods.
Yeah. And even how the Akan language itself is put together, its morphology.
So multiple linguistic angles where the critique sees issues.
And if you look at the book's foreword, it sounds really confident. It says it's proven the Egyptian origin of amen.
Proven it. Wow.
Yeah, and that the Akan language has these verbal relics that show they kind of own this deity.
But the critique sees a disconnect there.
Totally. It highlights that the foreword talks a lot about history, about religion, but it seems to skip the actual detailed linguistic work you'd need to back those big claims up.
Okay, so what's the core problem with their method, according to the critique?
Well, it sounds like the book's main strategy is basically finding any word in different languages that just happens to have the sounds M and N in that order.
And then saying, aha, it's linked to M.
Pretty much. The critique frames it as just spotting similar sounds rather than doing the proper deep analysis to show a real historical connection between the words.
Right, because languages borrow words, sounds change. It's complicated.
Exactly. Which brings us to how the book compares specific words. For instance, it takes the Twi words Nisamanfo, meaning ancestors, and Nisamando, which is the place where ancestors are said to dwell.
And links them to amen. How?
It suggests that for Akan speakers, ancestors are basically the people of Amen living in the land of Amen.
I see the sound similarity they're pointing to.
But the critique really pushes back hard here. It argues that the book misunderstands how Akan words actually work, like their structure.
How so?
Well, the root of those words, Nisamanfo and Nisamando, is apparently Osaman.
Okay.
The N at the start of Nisamanfo, that's just a standard plural marker in Akan. Like adding an S in English, it's not really part of the core meaning related to amen.
And Nisamando, the beginning there.
The critique says it should actually start with A, which makes it a noun. So the book seems to be ignoring these grammatical markers, these morpheme boundaries.
Focusing only on the sound sequence A-M-A-N or N-S-M-A-N.
Right. And the critique has this great analogy to show the flaw.
Oh, yeah. What is it?
It says it's like trying to argue that English words like salamander or adamant or even cameraman all come from amen just because they happen to have A, M, N, or M in them somewhere.
Okay, yeah, that makes it clear. You can't just pick letters out like that.
Exactly. It highlights why simply finding similar sounds or letter sequences isn't nearly enough to prove a real linguistic relationship.
So the critique calls this
folk etymology.
Yeah.
Which means, these explanations for word origins that sound interesting, maybe even plausible on the surface.
But they're not based on scientific linguistic methods.
Precisely. Fun stories, maybe, but not rigorous historical linguistics.
Got it. Does the critique mention if the book engages with other scholars who've looked into this?
That's another key point. It seems the book doesn't really acknowledge the work of Tata Theophile Obenga.
Obenga, who's he?
He's a linguist who has actually done work comparing M with contemporary African languages, so someone who's trod in similar ground.
And the book just doesn't mention it.
Apparently not, which the critique sees as a significant omission.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty big oversight. You'd expect them to engage with existing scholarship, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. The critique really stresses that point. You need to review the relevant literature and, have a robust method that goes way beyond just spotting these lookalike words.
Okay, so methodology and lack of engagement are major concerns.
Okay.
What about the historical claims? You mentioned Narmer earlier.
Right, Narmer, often considered the first pharaoh to unify Egypt, sometimes identified with Menes.
What does the book claim about him?
It claims his royal name was Heru, the soaring falcon of Amen.
Of Amen. Okay, that explicitly links him to Oman.
It does, but this is where the critique really goes to the sources. It directly contradicts the book.
Oh.
By looking at what Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, actually wrote about Egypt.
And what did Herodotus say?
Well, the critique points out that both in the original Greek and in English translations, Herodotus refers to the first king as Min or Mina.
Mina or Mina, not Menes.
Not Menes, according to the critique citing Herodotus directly. And crucially, no mention of Amen anywhere in the name Herodotus recorded.
Wow, okay, that's a direct contradiction from a primary source, albeit a Greek one.
It is, and the critique adds another layer, methodologically speaking.
Which is?
It points out that in ancient Greek, masculine proper nouns often end with an S. So a Greek rendering like Menes, even if Herodotus had used it, might not perfectly reflect the original Khamni pronunciation anyway.
So you have to be careful with names filtered through other languages.
Exactly. The critique argues you can't reliably determine the original Khamiti form just from the Greek spelling, especially with that final S.
Does the book have any other arguments for connecting Menes Mina to Amen?
It tries. It points to another name, Irka Men, which became Ergomenes in Greek, and seems to argue that this somehow proves Menes must also refer to Amen.
And the critique's take?
It basically dismisses this as faulty logic. Like, one name changing doesn't automatically mean another unrelated name means Amen.
So what was the actual Kamant name, according to the critique?
The critique points to Min. It likely derived from the root min, meaning to be firm, established, enduring.
Many, he who endures. Makes sense for a founding king.
Yeah, and it's formed through a regular linguistic process in hieroglyphs. The critique emphasizes that if you look at primary KMT sources, like the Turin Papyrus,
Which the book itself mentions, right?
yes, those sources consistently show En Sweet Birimi, that's king of Upper and Lower Egypt, many.
Many, M-N-I.
Right, and the critique stresses this. Many and M, Amen, are clearly different words, different forms, different meanings.
Even though they both have that MNT sound sequence.
Exactly. And to really drive this home, the critique mentions a search through, like, a standard hieroglyphic dictionary.
Yep.
It found 436 words containing the M hieroglyphic sign, the same sign used in Im.
436.
Wow. And these words have absolutely nothing to do with the God Amen. Things like knit, meaning mooring post, or NN doesn't mean it's related to MN.
Not at all. The critique lists several rulers, too, who had M and N names, clearly not derived from Im, like Menkara, Emenkera. Right, so the M element was common.
Very. The critique uses that old saying, if your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Suggesting the book's authors maybe only focused on Amen and tried to fit everything to
That seems to be the implication. Limited knowledge leading to forced interpretations. The critique insists that primary KMT sources, the Turin Canon, Abydos King List, Palermo Stone, early seals, all consistently show En Swait Bidi Me for that first ruler.
Many. Not Amen.
Not Amen. It questions why the book seems to rely more on later Greek interpretations than these earlier direct KMT sources.
Interesting. What about Narmer's name itself? The book had claims about that, too.
It did. The book claims the name Narmer has a phonetic value of N with an apostrophe,
Okay.
and that it's linked somehow to the catfish symbol and then later transforms into Imru or Im-In, meaning Amenhunuru.
That sounds like quite a leap. What does the critique say?
First, it corrects the transcription. The standard Egyptological way to write it is just Nar, N-A-R, no apostrophe.
Oh, Nar.
And it stresses that this written transcription shouldn't be confused with the actual ancient pronunciation, which is often uncertain.
Fair enough. What about the catfish?
The critique points out that the catfish glyph, which is indeed read as Nar, isn't just near the name on things like the Narmer palette. It is part of the name.
So the hieroglyphs for Narmer literally include a catfish.
Yes, along with the chisel glyph, which is Nar, Mr. Catfish Chisel.
Got it. So the book's claim about it being in proximity is misleading.
Seems so. And the critique then asks, okay, how does nar or nar suddenly become imru or im?
The book doesn't explain the linguistic steps.
Apparently not. The critique finds no explanation for this transformation. It also questions the book's claim about the catfish having some special shamanic or totemic significance in the royal symbol called a serek, without providing any actual evidence.
Just asserting it.
Seems like it. Then the book claims Narmer wasn't even his personal name.
Oh. What was it then, according to the book?
A royal title, meaning Haru Amen, the soaring falcon of Amen.
Okay, bringing Amen back in again.
Right. But the critique explains the established Egyptological understanding. Rulers had a Horus name.
The A part.
Exactly. Adar meaning Horus, usually written with the falcon symbol, followed by the ruler's actual personal name inside the serek.
Like Arnar Mister.
Precisely. Horus Narmer. The critique points out the obvious. The name Amen, is just not there. It's conspicuously absent in H.R. Narmis.
Makes sense. Why the consistent HR part then?
Because early rulers were known as Samzavio HR, followers of Horus, so the Horus name was standard.
Okay. And the soaring falcon.
Another small correction from the critique. The falcon in the serek is typically shown perched, not soaring.
Details matter, I guess.
They do. And the critique flatly rejects the idea that the whole serek symbol itself should somehow be read as im.
So basically the standard reading is Horus Narmer, personal name Narmer.
Yes. And finally, on Narmer, the critique challenges the book's claim that Narmer was a title carried by other earlier kings, too.
Other kings use the name Narmer.
That's what the book claims, apparently. But the critique asks, well, where's the evidence? Who are these other phantom kings? Because if it was a title, you'd expect to see multiple rulers using it. Right?
Yeah, you would.
Yeah.
Okay, so lots of issues with the Narmermanist claims. Does this pattern continue?
It seems so. The critique points out other, factual errors and misinterpretations, like a picture caption.
Hear about it.
The English caption says Amen in ancient Egypt. Simple enough.
But
the hieroglyph shown right next to it actually read Imra Ansut Nero.
Imra, so including Ra, the sun god.
Exactly. Amen-Ra, king of the gods, or divinities. Not just Amen. A significant difference, mixing up Amen and Amen-Ra.
And this links to another point the book makes.
Yes. The book explicitly states, Aman is a variation of Amen, while we and Ra constitute appellations for Amen.
So it's saying Ra is just another name for Amen.
That's what it says. But the critique clarifies, no, Ra is a distinct major deity, the sun god, often paired with Amen, yes, as in Amen-Ra.
Like in the hieroglyphs in that caption.
Right. But not just another name for Amen. The critique suggests this kind of fundamental error raises questions about the lead author's claimed expertise.
Yeah, that seems pretty basic Egyptology.
There's also an issue with a quote about Amen-Ra used in the book.
What's the problem there?
It's uncredited, no source given, and the critique notes it looks very, very similar to a well-known translation by E.A. Wallace Budge.
The famous Egyptologist.
Yeah, and Budge's translation clearly says Amen-Ra, again, not just Amen. So, two issues. The lack of citation, which smells like potential plagiarism.
And the fact that the quote itself contradicts the book's apparent conflation of Amen and Amen-Ra.
Exactly. It's messy.
What about the links to the Akan language? Any other examples the critique tackles?
Yes, it looks at the book's reference to the Akan people belonging to the Ayoko clan, whose primary deity was the falcon.
Okay, the Ayoko.
Well, first correction, the clan name is actually Ayoko.
Ayoko, got it.
And second, the Akaroma, which is a hawk or falcon, is their totem. In Akan terms, that's an Akayanaboa or Akraboa.
A totem, not a deity.
Right. A totem is different from an obism, which is the word for a deity or god. So the book misrepresents the clan's beliefs there.
And does it mention other clans?
No. The critique points out it fails to acknowledge the other 7 main Asante Matra clans, which also have their own distinct totems. Kind of tunnel vision again.
Okay. Any more linguistic issues?
Quite a few. The book apparently misuses the word simile when talking about Ra and something called we or we.
Claiming we is a simile for the sun.
Yeah, and linking it to the Mfanse word for sun. But the critique explains that the we or y ending you see in some hieroglyphic names.
Like in some pharaohs' names?
Exactly. Like Hotepsekamiri and Kasakamiri from the Second Dynasty. That y ending isn't about the sun at all.
What is it then?
It's the masculine dual ending in ancient Egyptian. It means two. So Hotepsekamyo means something like the 2 powers are at peace, and Kasakamui is the 2 powers appear. The Y refers to the two powers or scepters, nothing to do with an emphanse word for sun.
Ah, so a complete misunderstanding of the grammar.
It seems like it. The critique also corrects the book's dating and numbering of these pharaohs within their dynasty. Small errors, maybe, but they add up.
And the book tries to interpret other pharaoh names using a can.
Yes, names like Amenhotep, Amenes, and one called Amenemonet.
And the critique argues this is flawed.
Deeply flawed, according to the critique. It says the book just breaks these Egyptian names apart wherever it likes, ignoring the actual morpheme boundaries, the meaningful units within the words.
And then tries to mack Akan meanings onto the fragments.
Exactly. The critique uses this slightly absurd example to illustrate the point. It says it's like analyzing Amenhotep as Amen-hot-EP.
Okay, yeah, that's clearly nonsense.
Right. And then it provides the actual accepted analysis for Amenhotep, MHTP, meaning Amen is satisfied or Amen is at peace.
Based on actual hieroglyphic roots.
Correct. Similarly, for Amenmes, the book tries to break down the Nizi part, which means to give birth in Egyptian, using Akan and a wrongly assumed Egyptian phrase for my father. The critique shows this doesn't work linguistically.
And Amenemonet.
The critique points out there's no source given for this name even existing, let alone the bizarre meaning the book assigns it. Godfather in the mansion.
Godfather in the mansion. Where did that come from?
Good question. The critique basically concludes that all these interpretations rely on just finding sounds that look vaguely similar.
And then inventing backstories.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Rather than using any sound linguistic methodology. The critique also notes the book sometimes resorts to claiming the original name was corrupted to make its interpretations fit.
Which sounds like a convenient excuse if the evidence doesn't match.
It can be, yeah. The overall assessment is that a lack of real knowledge of hieroglyphs and basic linguistic principles undermines all these claims.
Are there other unsupported claims the critique mentions?
Yes, a couple of quite striking ones. There's an anecdote in the book about a song.
What song?
A song dedicated to Amen, which the book claims was the very last song sung by Africans as they were forced onto slave ships.
Wow, that's a powerful image.
Extremely powerful. But the critique asks, where is the evidence for this? What's the source? Which song? Which cathal? Which ethnic groups? It seems to be presented without any historical backing or possibility of verification.
Just stated as fact.
Apparently. And similarly, the book asserts that the well-known African-American spiritual Amen.
The call and response one.
That one. The book claims it's a direct remnant, a survival of an ancient West African, specifically Ghanaian chant to Amen.
Again, a strong claim. Evidence.
Again, the critique says there's no evidence or citation provided to support this direct link across centuries and continents. It's just asserted.
What about historical references? Any other errors there?
There's one about Amenemhet I. The book supposedly claims an inscription at Thebes, says he was the son of a woman named Nofret from Elephantine Island.
Okay.
And that this is confirmed by a text called the Prophecy of Nefertiti.
And is it?
Not according to the critique. It quotes the actual lines from the prophecy.
You have to show
that a ruler named Ameni will come from the south. He'll be the son of a woman from Tasseti, which is Nubia.
Nubia, not Elephantine.
Right. And he originates from Nekin, ancient Hierakonpolis. And crucially, the prophecy doesn't even name his mother. So the book's claim seems wrong on multiple counts.
Location, mother's name, not matching the source text.
Exactly.
So the critique raises questions about the author's interpretations, their methodology. Does it say anything about the authors themselves?
It does, briefly. It notes some questions about the lead author's specific degrees and postgraduate studies mentioned.
Okay, and the other authors?
The second author describes himself as having modest training in Coptic, hieroglyphs, using the term metuniter, which the critique corrects to MDWNTR, and ancient Greek.
Modest training. But the critique found issues with his analysis of Herodotus, right?
It did, which perhaps raises questions about the depth of that Greek training, at least as applied in the book. The critique also finds it odd that the authors seem unaware that the catfish sign is read Nar.
The very sign in Narmer's name.
Yes. The third author's background is noted as being in history.
Okay. Anything about the physical book itself?
Just a few observations from the critique. It mentions that the use of actual hieroglyphic script in the book is pretty limited, mostly just scanned images, suggesting they didn't use proper hieroglyphic processing software.
Which you might expect for a book analyzing the language.
You might. Limited photo credits, too. And ironically, the word amen doesn't actually appear in hieroglyphs on the book's covers, even though they feature hieroglyphs.
Interesting.
It also lists the chapters, mentions appendices on amen in the Bible and cultural continuity, notes the lack of an index, a limited glossary, and a bibliography that mixes scholarly sources with, well, less scholarly ones.
So pulling it all together, what's the critique's final evaluation? Is the book useful at all?
The critique concludes that, although it's aimed at a general audience, the sheer number of errors makes it potentially misleading.
But is there anything positive?
It does concede one main strength. The book gathers data that could potentially be used for future research, maybe using proper historical linguistic methods, either to support or refute the claims, and it definitely starts a conversation about amen outside the usual Judeo-Christian box.
But the big weakness is?
The lack of rigorous methodology and, crucially, the apparent lack of pre-publication review by actual experts in hieroglyphs, comparative linguistics, and morphosemantics.
So the core thesis, the link between Kemente's im and modern languages like Aken,
is ultimately undermined in the critique's view. Undermined by these spuria lookalikes, these folk etymologies, all stemming from what the critique sees as a fundamental lack of linguistic expertise.
Does the critique worry about the impact of the book?
It expresses a concern that, despite the author's sincere intentions, the book, with its flaws, might unfortunately provide ammunition for people who want to dismiss Afrocentric scholarship more broadly.
Because the methodology isn't sound.
Right. But it ends on a slightly hopeful note, suggesting the book will spark conversation and hopefully inspire more rigorous research to establish mat truth and dispel a sift falsehood on this topic.
Okay, so to sum up our deep dive then, this critique we've been exploring really raises some significant flags about the methods, the accuracy, and the overall claims made in the book about the origins and connections of the word amen.
Yeah, serious questions about whether the evidence presented actually supports the conclusions drawn.
And for you, our listener, aiming to get a handle on complex topics, quickly but also thoroughly, we hope this has given you that critical perspective from the Ghana Journal of Linguistics critique, without getting too lost in the weeds.
Definitely some surprising moments in there, I think, like the direct contradiction from Herodotus.
Yeah, that was striking. And just how many other Kameni words have that MM sequence but mean totally different things.
And the fundamental errors the critique points out in analyzing both Egyptian and Aken language structures.
It certainly shows it's not as simple as just spotting similar sounds.
Not at all. And this whole discussion probably raises even more questions for you, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We'd really encourage you, if you're interested, to explore these fields further: historical linguistics, Egyptology, Akan language, and culture. They're all fascinating areas.
Definitely.
And maybe here's a final thought to leave you with. How crucial is it, really, to have that solid research method, that genuine expertise, when we're trying to build bridges between different cultures, different languages, across huge spans of history?
And maybe what are the potential pitfalls, the dangers of just relying on those surface similarities, those appealing stories, without doing the deeper, more rigorous analysis? Something to think about.
Indeed. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.